We already posted a massive review of the Steam Deck's hardware, including in-depth thermals, noise, and even Schlieren imaging testing, and we followed up with a teardown. Today we're focusing entirely on user experience. The deck is now officially out. We are now allowed to talk about the software, so that includes SteamOS, the Linux desktop option, and overall our experiences using the deck for the last couple of weeks now. We've been using it since we got it in for our initial coverage, and that includes taking it on a plane when we flew out to Newegg. So we got some real in-the-field use for this one. Let's get started. Before that, this video is brought to you by Lian Li's O11D Evo case. The O11D Evo is a mid-tower that tested well previously with us and is most interesting for attention to fine details and its unique features. One of those is the easy-to-use invertible layout. The O11D Evo inversion process is the easiest we've ever worked with on a case, allowing it to flip entirely for a unique upside-down build or work as a standard layout. The O11D Evo has 2 chambers for the system and the power supply, support for up to 9 storage drives, and edge-to-edge glass for a showcase, while still offering excellent airflow through side and bottom intakes. Learn more at the link in the description below. So quick primer on the goals for this video. We'll be looking mostly at things like how the controls feel, ergonomics, positioning of things. So that's far more on the subjective side of things. Keep that in mind. It is the collective opinion of everyone here on the team. This is about 5 people or so putting into this. And then we'll also be looking a little more objectively at the software and the user interface and experience. That's where things start to, it doesn't fall apart, but it's not as solid of an argument as the Steam Deck had with just the look at the hardware that we did previously. And again, if you want in-depth hardware, we're not going to talk about any of that here. We'll link it below. There's no need to do it all a second time. So key points up front. When we were flying out to do the Newegg video, we spent probably in total about 12 hours or so on planes going back and forth. The Steam Deck was used for much of that time up until its battery died, which on the first leg of the trip was about 2.5 hours. And on the second leg of the trip, we got a good maybe 3 hours out of it with lower end games. But we already have battery testing, so you can check out, we'll put one of the charts up on the screen now from the previous results. Anyway, the point is, Andrew, Stone, and I all worked on the Steam Deck, played on it while we were flying, and the most immediate thing we wanted to point out after that experience was that this is a device that, as much as it resembles a console, obviously it's really not. It's a computer, except it doesn't have a keyboard. And so in that regard, it's much more like an Aya Neo or a GPD or something, and because of that, it means you have a lot of freedom, just like you do with a computer. And that also means you're going to have a lot of problems, like you would with a computer. So we wanted to really manage expectations immediately getting into this. This is not the Steam Deck. It's not going to be like buying a Nintendo Switch, where everything basically just works, and if it doesn't work with the Switch, there's not a lot you can do about it anyway, so it's really not worth even worrying about if software doesn't work on the Switch, because you have no recourse. With the Steam Deck, the cool thing is you could probably fix whatever the problem is. The uncool thing is that there will be a lot of problems because software is complicated, and there's literally millions upon millions of combinations of things you can do in software that has given the user as much control as SteamOS or Windows or anything else you might put on the Steam Deck. Now, we see that as a positive, but our core audience and what we do relates to power users, enthusiasts, people who are not afraid of troubleshooting something and fixing it, and might even enjoy that aspect if it affords them some extra freedoms and capabilities in the hardware that they own. What it also means, though, is that if you're buying this for someone who maybe doesn't have quite the troubleshooting capabilities as you do, or as our core audience, or if you are that person, then just don't get too frustrated when an error message pops up or something doesn't quite work well. And to be clear, that's not all just because of Valve and Steam and the OS. It's because it's not railroading you. So all that out of the way up front. Software is not perfect. It's pretty good, though, for what it is, but we do have some key criticisms we'll be going through. And managing expectations, we also wanted to note that SteamOS 3.0, it's a custom version of Arch Linux, and that's a big hurdle for most PC games to clear. So this isn't SteamOS 1.0, which was tried with the Steam machines previously. Valve has tried this before. When Valve worked with third-party manufacturers for HTPCs, that would run Valve's own Debian-based Linux distro, or Debian, fight me, Linux users. It was an interesting idea, but it didn't go anywhere. So Valve signaled this time that it doesn't want SteamOS to fail. It has iterated significantly. It's put 4 years into building Proton up, which is the compatibility layer to help Windows games run successfully on Linux. Proton is by no means perfect, and we've seen that in the past month or so, but the community maintains a list of Proton-supported games, and by extension, those games probably work on the Steam Deck. So that's at ProtonDB, and you need to know that if you're going to buy one of these or you already have, because it will make your life a lot easier if you can just look for the games that'll work instead of downloading them to find out they don't work well. This database also has games that are completely inoperable. A lot of the time, this is because of anti-cheat software, so you have no way to work around it. It just won't work. Valve also has its own semi-crowdsourced verification system that it calls Deck Verified. You can check this one as well, and that's officially public now. But the bottom line is that many games work with some tweaking. Many games work out of box, and then a whole lot won't work at all or have mixed success just because this is all very new. There are tens of thousands of games probably, at least, on Steam, and they're not all going to work, obviously. So that's what you need to know. That's the expectations management we wanted to do. The hardware was very exciting and interesting, pretty well designed, as we showed. The software needs time to mature. The good news about software is that it can be downloaded. So it's not like hardware where it's fixed. They got the part that is unchangeable done right. So that's good. Enough of that. Let's talk about how the controls feel and go through the software as well. This is a collection of notes from primarily Patrick, and I worked on it as well, and then we had input from everyone on the team as they played around with the device. Let's get started. Talking about the physical hardware and usability, for the most part, the deck is more comfortable to hold than a flat device like a Switch, but the sheer quantity of controls leads to crowding, and it also explains the size. The D-pad, the face buttons, and the touchpads are all competing for the same space, but the placement of the joysticks and the face buttons is less awkward than it appears, at least visually. Both of them fall within the natural arc of thumb movement. We're less happy with the buttons on the back, which are hard to press on purpose and easy to press by accident. For most of us, the ideal grip position was with the index and middle fingers resting on the bumpers and the triggers, and with the ring and pinky fingers on the rear buttons. That keeps all of the face buttons in reach, but unfortunately makes it even harder to bear down on the rear buttons. We'll be interested to see whether user-created controller configurations make more use of the touchpads and the grip buttons, as they take up significant space but aren't part of the traditional control schemes. Some quick information on how everything works. Our teardown video previously shows how all this comes together. The triggers actuate a compression spring, providing resistance, and then the press is registered. Typically, controllers will use either a potentiometer or a Hall effect sensor to do this. This is standard for a controller for construction of the trigger. The grip buttons are a little bit different since they're less common. These are plastic springs, so it's just a piece of plastic that moves and hits a standard tact switch. The face buttons and the D-pad both use conductive ring and pill pads. The conductive pad contacts the exposed trace on the PCB when pressed, triggering the button press in software. This is also standard and in basically every controller on the market. So in short, the face buttons, the D-pad, the triggers, and the joysticks work as you would expect from any other controller on the market. There's nothing revolutionary going on inside the Steam Deck in terms of controller design. So this is mostly a good thing because it doesn't really need to be reinvented. So no new construction in this aspect. The analog joysticks are also standard for modern controllers, and they have an added capacitive touch sensor. Joy-Con drift isn't specific to just Joy-Cons. These types of joysticks can also develop drift with time, but these are relatively easy to replace on the Steam Deck compared to some of the other parts of the Steam Deck, so this is one that you wouldn't need to worry too much about. It's 3 screws after you get through the initial 8. In terms of sizing, the deck is relatively large in order to accommodate all the controls, extending 6 centimeters out past the edge of the screen in both directions, but devices like the Io Neo and arguably the Switch have already exited the pocket-sized realm anyway, so the size matters less to us than the weight does. A deck weighs 676 grams, about 1.5 pounds, while a Switch OLED with Joy-Cons attached weighs 420 grams, with the original at 400, or about 0.9 pounds for both. That can make a difference when there's no table or armrest to lean on for long periods, and we have thoughts on that after using it on a plane when we flew out to Newegg. Overall, though, we found the deck comfortable to use, or at least not any less comfortable than similar handhelds. The grips are isolated from electronics and mostly hollow, which ensures that they stay cool for skin temperature. The front-facing speakers are worth the real estate that they take up. Audio sounds good, and it's surprisingly directional, and it won't be blocked by resting the deck on its edge in a dock if you had one. The anti-glare screens on our units are subtle. It's an improvement over the original screen, but not one that we'd notice without it being pointed out to us. The SSDs are the only important difference then between the SKUs. The screen we don't think is a huge difference. That noted, the viewing angles are extremely limited. Once you're at about 15 degrees, the screen starts to become just black. That's fine, but any onlookers to your screen will need to be relatively close. Speaking to haptics and rumble, the Steam Deck uses what it calls HD haptics to convey any sense of rumble at all. Most controllers that you're probably familiar with, especially older ones, really commonly leaned on a big spinning weight to create that heavier rumble. So you could think of the DualSense versus the DualShock controllers as an example of this, or maybe the Nintendo Switch's HD rumble feature. The dictionary definition of the word haptic is really all-encompassing. It just means, quote, relating to or based on a sense of touch. So in that regard, all rumble is technically haptic. But in this industry, when someone talks about haptics versus rumble, there's a very clear understanding of the difference. And generally speaking, haptic refers to a light buzzing feedback that's created by linear actuators rather than a big spinning weight inside of the controller. So that's the difference. Now, Sony and Nintendo have both chosen to advertise their move to linear actuators as a feature rather than a downside. Valve, when it launched the Steam controller, advertised this as a feature. But with the Steam Deck, Valve came across as almost apologetic when explaining the state of haptics before our preview embargo. Quote, during the development of this product, we made an intentional decision not to prioritize beefy rumble motors for the Steam Deck. Reason being that the added weight, hit to battery life, and cost did not justify the added benefit. The work we're doing now is to get as close as possible to emulating rumble without actually having the hardware built in. So, to make a long story short on what Valve says it's doing is it's better now. However, in its current state, the rumble has been turned down so far that it's barely noticeable at all. We're mouse and keyboard users, so that's fine by us. But the vibrating units are located in the touchpads on either side of the controller. It's diffused and spread out by that little squiggly metal bar that's attached to each side of the touchpad. So the amount of feedback felt during gameplay varies greatly based on whether you're using the touchpads or not. Our biggest complaint about the form factor with a direct, inarguable solution is that there's only one USB Type-C port. Attaching more than one device, so a charger, mouse, keyboard, or a monitor, requires a hub or Bluetooth. There really should be at least one other port on this thing, maybe on the bottom or something, which would allow creating a dock that the Steam Deck could slot into like a Switch. As it is, even the first-party deck dock will use a right-angle cable routed out and around the back of the deck. So if you want a charger and a USB stick, a charger and an external SSD, a charger and a mouse or a keyboard in order to navigate some of the menus, then you'll need to use a hub, and that starts to get about as cumbersome as using one with a modern laptop. One further hardware note too, the charge indicator on the deck is a white LED. It turns on when the deck is plugged in and off when it's not, but it doesn't communicate any useful information about the charge status. So some small stuff like this shows some of Valve's inexperience with designing hardware devices. Time to talk about the biggest potential weak point of the Steam Deck, which is its software. Fortunately for Valve, this is also the thing that's easiest for it to improve over time, since it can just be downloaded. Steam already has Big Picture Mode, and that's a feature that offers a console-style interface on Windows without replacing the whole OS. It's not perfect, but it works well enough on an Aya Neo, and it doesn't come with the compatibility issues of switching to Linux. In our estimation, the main advantages of SteamOS over Windows for handheld gaming are that the UI is designed from the ground up to be navigated with controller inputs, and that the drivers, the software, and the updates are specifically tailored to the deck hardware. None of those advantages are overwhelming when you compare them to the decades-long history of Windows being the default platform for PC games. But you could install Windows on the Steam Deck if you wanted, at least if it ever gets the AMD drivers we were promised. And given the history of Hades Canyon, we're not hopeful long-term for those to be updated as they should be, but we'll see. SteamOS UI has been in flux since the day we received the decks back in January, and it will continue to change unless the deck completely flops. Updates are nearly daily at this point. The desktop Steam UI has been changing for an awareness of mortality inducing 18 years now, just for Steam itself, not even SteamOS, and we expect that the SteamOS will follow the same path if it sticks around. Most of the deck UI changes have been too minor to bother listing, but improvements are happening. As of now, the least intuitive aspect is that there are 4 menu-ish buttons on the deck. There's the 3-lined hamburger menu or start button, the 2 rectangle view back button, and the Steam button, and also an ellipsis button. Getting used to the individual functions of these buttons takes some time. The library could also use work. Many Steam users already have hundreds of deck-compatible games, and as of this writing, the deck UI is less graceful at handling large libraries than the desktop client is. It's really hard to put it into concrete terms with just writing, so we filmed our CPU cooler test technician, Mike, as he was given instructions to find a Total War game already in our library. Mike has not used the Steam Deck at all, at least not before this, and so he was a good team member candidate to subject to this test.
So library.
I guess that was a good one since there's a million Total War games.
Yeah, like he definitely owns 3 Kingdoms on this test account.
Okay, so. Installed all games. How do I search in our all games? Is this?
I'm not supposed to help you here.
Oh, that's right. Okay. I keep feeling like I'm being made a fool of here. that I'm
every
set up
other
to
person
fail.
in the office has done this except for Steve.
Oh wait, why?
Knows the answer.
Sort by alphabetical, and then I guess I'd just go down. I feel like I'm taking the most caveman approach just because I'm Tomb Raider.
The tip I'll give you is that every other person that's done this has
Hold
done the
on.
same thing that you're doing.
Wait, hold on. I see Tomb Raider, but then no, it thinks it's Shadow of the Tomb Raider, so I'm not in the T's. Never mind. Oh, Total War. Okay. So there's our Total War games.
All right, cool. So there is, you see there's no search buttons listed down here. There's no prompts to do a search thing. But there is a search bar at the top of the screen here.
Oh.
And this is a search bar for games that are on here, games that are in your library, and friends, and the store, and for tools.
Yeah, there's a lot going on.
So the search button isn't obvious, and a lot of other stuff isn't either. It's just, this is a microcosm for the wider issue of usability. Another poor usability example, in the Steam UI, the B button functions as a back button, which doesn't line up with what we're used to, although it sounds like it makes sense. Usually it would go up a level, not return to the previous screen. Remember, this functions more like a traditional OS than like a really railroaded Switch OS or something, and so some of the behaviors are a little bit out of line with what you'd expect on a console. Just as a counter to all this, on the Switch, which is the most obvious comparison, the B button always does the same thing. It always goes up one level, so big difference there in how they behave. Now, Valve is less capable of improving the UIs for individual games because they're developed by other companies. So this is another potential shortcoming where we ran into at least one instance where the text for the menu and on the screen did not scale with the device itself, and it was illegible. This is when I was trying to use it on a plane when we were flying out to Newegg, and opening up the menu, I had to hold the Steam Deck about here to see it, and I don't have any vision problems. So it doesn't always scale adequately, and that's not something Valve has a lot of control over. Now, in between when that happened to us and now, Valve shipped another update, which is a small magnifier that is a workaround to this problem, where you can magnify certain elements of the screen if you have no other way to see them, so you can at least navigate the menus and increase the text size, the UI size. So they're aware of it. It's not a clean fix, but it is a workaround at least. So ultimately that highlights the same issue of usability. Now, there's also desktop mode. Desktop mode is a bit rough. It's weird and inconvenient to get to. It is not designed to be navigated with a controller, and it feels like it was never really intended to be used outside of a development environment. The desktop is a regular KDE Plasma interface that isn't natively suited to the deck, and installing Linux applications will be a new experience for many users. Valve has stated that, quote, "We plan to make it easier to add apps directly from the non-Steam Games tab implied here without having to go to the desktop. To launch non-Steam applications like Discord or Chrome, they have to be installed in desktop mode. We were able to install Firefox, add it to Steam, launch it, open a YouTube video, and then seamlessly swap back and forth between the browser and Half-Life 2 with the video still playing. So at least that much feels relatively fluid. In terms of navigation, the desktop mode, we used it a lot for our earlier testing when we were looking at all the different thermals, the frame time presentation metrics, all of that, because we needed to access certain files. That was done through desktop. Doing so, it really feels like it's best suited to a keyboard and mouse for any type of more advanced navigation. Using the touchscreen to navigate is a little bit awkward, so short of doing a mouse and keyboard setup via a hub, your next most obvious choice would be the trackpads on the device. We can carry this logic forward and infer that the trackpads will make it easier to play games that were designed with a mouse in mind, but the lack of a physical keyboard remains an obstacle in those instances. And having the second trackpad, which for us typically was this one on the left, was really not helpful. We didn't have any natural uses for it. It seems like its biggest use is really just to help transfer the haptic feedback evenly across the deck rather than an actual input device. In the weeks leading up to the launch, the most frequent changes have been to the performance menu. This menu is useful for limiting or increasing the performance, and so it has a direct impact on things like battery life. As of this writing, this menu contains a performance overlay slider, that'd be for FPS, GPU usage, things like that, a 30 FPS frame rate limit toggle. This control was originally more granular and will be patched back in at a later date. There's a 0 to 15 watt TDP limit slider, a manual GPU clock control toggle that currently hard crashes and reboots the deck. There's an upscaling filter with options for linear, nearest, integer, and AMD FSR, and a show performance overlay and Steam toggle that we'd recommend leaving off. The performance overlay has potential to be misleading, so be careful how you use it. Outside of games, it doesn't really work well. That's because it updates whenever there's input, basically, whenever there's a new frame generated. So if you're using it in something like Blender, the data is not going to be up to date or accurate if things are happening in the background and there's not active updating on the screen. But in games, it's fine. Many of these options existed in menus before today, but they didn't function properly. Some of them still don't function properly, but it's a lot better than it was when we did our initial hardware-only coverage of the Steam Deck. More detailed control is also possible if you're into things like editing config files, so plenty of room there to play around. For example, you could turn off individual CPU threads, or you could do some basic overclocking or frequency adjustment, underclocking, things like that through the tuning utilities as well. One big note for today is that Valve has implemented a 60 FPS cap. You can turn this off, so don't freak out. But it's a hard 60 FPS cap universally for release. This, we think, has to do more with how a lot of media outlets took our testing and ran it out of context, sensationalized it, and made sure to only publish the worst looking number for Valve. Yes, we have a bone to pick with those of you who've done that. You know who you are. What Valve says is the reason for the 60 FPS cap is, quote, FPS wobbliness and instability with the full granular controls. Now, the reason we think it's more to do with the battery life is because when we did our initial hardware review, we were extremely clear with the methodology for everything. We were really detailed. We took a lot of care to make sure everything was packaged and presented in a way where, in theory, you wouldn't really be able to take things out of context unless you really tried. And, oh, did we really underpredict how many other excellent headlines would be created from our data when stripped out of context. Bringing up that battery chart from the original review, what you'll see is we have one number on there, that's 87 minutes. And as we said in the original review, that is only under a ridiculous scenario where we were running Devil May Cry 5 with very high graphics settings. We disabled VSync, which is also, it's a reasonable trade-off to restrict the frame rate on a handheld battery-operated device. And we boosted the graphics settings, and we were pulling about 30 watts deliberately for the life of the 87 or so minute test. Now, what happened is, instead of people reporting on GN determines that the battery life range is between 87 minutes and approximately 6 hours, or reporting on GN says that the average battery life range is somewhere around 2 hours with higher settings and maybe 4 to 6 with lower settings, and that GN was unable to reproduce Valve's claimed 8-hour number. No, instead, what was run was the Steam Deck battery might die in under 90 minutes, or the Steam Deck battery barely lives for an hour and a half. The Steam Deck battery dies in just over an hour. We talked about this internally when it happened. We thought about running a standalone video at the time, but it seemed like too dedicated of a call out, so we just put it in here. But irresponsible reporting. Anyway, the information on the batteries in the original. The point here, though, is that Valve has implemented a 60 FPS cap. You can turn it off, but it's there for a reason, and the reason is it will help preserve the battery life, and no, it is not unreasonable to limit the frame rate on something like this. We would do the same on a laptop. You're not really using it to try and get max FPS in Rainbow Six Siege for competitive play when you're operating on battery on a screen that is the size of a phablet. And just in case those media outlets are watching, some basic math here. A 40 watt-hour battery should be able to sustain 30 watts for about 1.33 hours. The basic 40 divided by 30. The deck died in 1.45 hours, so that's almost right on the money. So it is possible to kill the deck in under 2 hours, but in most instances it should be easy to avoid with in-game settings or the FPS cap. Also, something that was oddly left out of all those pieces was that this isn't something that's going to sneak up on you. You'll know. It's very easy to see how fast the battery is dying when you're running it at those settings, and you can adjust for it before you get too far along. And just before anyone does it, you could use a screwdriver and a paperclip and kill the battery much faster, probably in under 2 minutes, maybe even nearly instantaneously, depending on how you do it, but that doesn't count. A couple other things for software. So in Steam mode, there's a complete lack of control over resolution right now, or refresh rate, or anything else for external displays. This is something that we'd like to see fixed before Valve ships the official dock. Right now, the deck simply runs at the resolution of the display that it's connected to. Anecdotally as well, we didn't have any issues playing games in offline mode. This will vary greatly by title, but it seems much easier to launch and play a game without a Wi-Fi connection than it has been in the past, which was one of our major concerns about a mobile PC without a SIM card. Games that support saving data to the Steam cloud also work really well. You could feasibly play your game at 1280 by 800 on the bus. You go home, synchronize with the cloud, pull down the save file, and continue where you left off. Multiple accounts, also very easy to work with. So this is on the upside of the UI and UX design, where Valve's done really well. You can keep the accounts logged in, you can log them out if you want, and switch between them no problems. If one account has a game that the other account does not have, like your roommate or your friend, then the user logged in who does not have the game can request to borrow the game from the account also on the device that owns the game. And this is within Steam's base functionality, but it works extremely well on the Steam Deck, so that's awesome to see. And finally here, sleep states like S3, S4, Hibernate, Sleep have always been a major challenge point for Windows software testing. And in this scenario, suspending and resuming single-player games with the latest version of all of this, and then putting the device to sleep, bringing it back up works fine. It worked every time we tried it. It doesn't sound like praise to say a feature simply works, but sleep states are notorious for breaking software, and we were able to get it to work just fine. So that's good too. And these weird UI behaviors happen everywhere. In fact, as we were writing and filming this, just about 12 hours before embargo lift for this, there was another update that came out that gives you the option to now launch multiple applications and run things in the background. So when we were done with one game, instead of closing it properly, we just went back to the Steam menu, opened another game, and it pops up a prompt. And the prompt says you can close the instance you just attempted to launch and leave the original in the background. You can switch to the original and cancel launching, or you can launch both anyway, which obviously isn't advisable for performance reasons. What is not present, though, is an option to close the original application and then switch to the new one. And the only reason this is really worth mentioning as a minor thing overall is because it illustrates a general lack of sufficient focus groups where Valve probably needs to be working with more people, and now it will be, by its customers, in order to collect enough information to figure out how to fine-tune the behaviors and options. But then there are upsides too. So controller support is fantastic. We tried every controller from every major console in the last 2 or 3 generations. We even tried the Amazon Luna one, and it worked fine. So Steam Deck didn't really seem to have any issues picking up controllers at all, and that stands true for the oddities. Finally here, one other note, gyro control is a feature that Valve showed off when the Steam Deck launched, but it wasn't active in any of the games that we could show in our preview. Now we've had a chance to try it out, and it's exactly what you might expect. The gyro movement is distracting, and it interferes with normal controls. We'd actually prefer a system-wide setting to turn it off entirely, rather than having to do it on a per-game controller configurator basis. It was pitched as a way to help fine-tune aim in things like Doom, but we actually found it harder to work with, and I would prefer to not use it. So technically, the gyro works exactly as expected. It is functional. It's just that the function is not well applied to anything we've tested. Maybe there's some use cases in the future, perhaps in VR hardware, for example. Now, with the deck, the controller configurator has become an extremely important part of Steam now. The deck has lots of inputs: touchscreen, trackpads, face buttons, rear buttons, gyro, and capacitive joysticks. With access to the entire Steam library now, it can be used to play both games that have native controller support and games that need third-party controller profiles. The first works pretty much out of box. The Steam Deck has all the buttons of an Xbox controller, so that's easy. The second kind of game requires the configurator, either selecting a preset profile or manually creating one, which isn't hard. Anyone who's tried to use a controller in Counter-Strike Go more than a couple months ago knows how spotty controller support on Steam can be. On the deck, each game page has a button that can be used to access controller settings, and from here, the current layout can be viewed or edited, or individual settings can be edited quickly. There are many templates available as well, so although it's visually overwhelming, it's awesome that there's this much customization available. Probably some of these should be hidden under an advanced menu to not overwhelm people who are expecting a Switch experience, but this feeds back into what we were saying earlier, which is that the Steam Deck is really for a mid-step between a sort of power user and someone who just wants an off-the-shelf console to work. You will be able to do a little bit more, and sometimes you'll have to do a little bit more in order to get the experience you want, but that is sort of the beauty of basically a PC anyway. So concluding then, it's what we said in the intro leading up to the controls discussion, which is that it's all about managing expectations. The hardware, as we showed previously, it's well designed. It works pretty well. Things are in spec thermally. The acoustic profile is not bad. We thought it needed to change to the hysteresis and the fan behavior, fan ramp and deramp. But overall, we were pretty positive on the hardware, which is rare for us. So that was good. As stated earlier, though, it's the software that matters. Software can be downloaded, so if you're willing to be the beta tester and you think that Valve will stick with this, then the hardware is in good shape, so all you'll have to worry about is Valve updating the software. The software now is functional. You can definitely play games on it. As stated before, the biggest thing you need to do is check ProtonDB or Valve's own deck verified list and make sure the games you care about are on those lists. They will be adding more. They've been adding more. There have been daily to, I think we've seen as much as 3 times a day updates to SteamOS at this point. It is changing rapidly. That means mostly good things, but sometimes Valve breaks stuff on the way to implementing new things. So really then the takeaway of thinking about that end of things is that this, we think, is still in the camp of being largely an enthusiast / power user device where you are very close to being in a live development environment for the software as we've experienced it. Maybe they'll change that in the next weeks as it goes public, but that's been our experience, which is fine, and we like that because it's not foreign to us. But if that doesn't sound like the experience you want, then our recommendation is obviously going to be to wait a little bit and see how things mature, in the very least so that it's less frustrating as Valve ships updates. And so if you're in a later round for the pre-orders, you don't really have a lot to be too upset about, because when you get it, it's just going to be easier for you to use. So for the user who's expecting take it out of the box and it works like a Switch experience, that's not what you're getting, but that is why it's cool. It's just as long as we're all on the same page there. It's a bad thing if you think that's what you're getting. It's a good thing if you understand that you're buying a PC that looks like this and has Linux on it. You can put Windows on it though. One final point we really want to get across here is that the Steam Deck is not a finished product. The SteamOS, the UI, and the user experience are easily the weakest aspects of this entire thing. It's very clear to us now why Valve had delayed the launch so much. It's not because of the hardware, it's because of the software. But they're updating it every day. So there's a light at the end of the tunnel there. It's just that if you don't want to be a beta tester, you shouldn't be buying this anytime soon. That's just kind of our opinion on it. Now, that said, we think it's cool and fun, but we're also technicians who work on this stuff because it's fun for us to work on it. So if you don't have that same perspective, then just keep that in mind. Maybe you should wait a little bit longer. We do think there's a lot of potential here. It's in a pretty good spot right now overall, but it is a little bit cumbersome at times, and we want to make sure everyone knows that, because there's a lot of hype behind this, and it's not for everyone. So rapid recap then. Hardware attention to detail is excellent. The software attention to detail, it's okay, but there's a lot of stuff we ran into where just frankly it really seems like Valve needs to get more input from people outside the company to give it ideas on what's the expected behavior. Probably this is a scenario where the people working on the Steam Deck are so close to it that they maybe their thinking is influenced by knowing everything about the device, and that's really common in development. So they'll get there, we think, but it's just a matter of time at this point. We'll keep following up with this. We have a lot more ideas we want to do with the Steam Deck, especially on the hardware side, so you will see more hardware coverage from us. Subscribe to catch that and check back, and keep an eye out. A lot more coming. Thanks for watching. As always, subscribe for more. Go to store.gamersnexus.net to help us out directly, or you can go to patreon.com/gamersnexus. We'll see you all next time.